My name's Jake, I'm 32, and that fall morning I decided to head out solo on one of the most well-known trails in the Great Smoky Mountains, Tennessee. I was gearing up for a several-hour hike, something I'd done before, but never with the same uneasy feeling I had that day. The sun had barely started to peek over the horizon, and the crisp morning air felt clearer, purer. I was excited, but there was something about the deep silence of the mountains that made even the wind seem odd. It wasn't the kind of place you'd want to be alone in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Around the third hour of hiking, as the trail started to narrow and the terrain got steeper, I noticed a man ahead of me. He appeared out of nowhere, almost like he'd stepped out from behind a tree. At first I thought he was just another hiker, but something was off. The guy wasn't carrying a backpack or any hiking gear. He was just wearing a simple shirt and jeans, like he was strolling through a city park, not on some remote, rugged trail. He didn't seem bothered by the terrain or the distance, just walking silently beside me, never looking at me or saying a word. The hike quickly became uncomfortable. Even with the total silence between us, I could feel the man beside me, almost like a strange presence, but not threatening. He wasn't rushing, didn't seem tired. It was like he was just there to walk with me for no apparent reason. The sound of my steps and breath was swallowed by the mountain's quiet, but he didn't make a single sound. I tried to strike up a conversation, anything to break the silence, but he didn't respond. "Hey, you good?" I asked, trying not to sound too rattled. Nothing. He just kept walking, unbothered, like I wasn't even there. That was enough to start really bugging me. That's when I decided to stop and look back, maybe hoping to find some kind of visual explanation. Maybe a backpack. Something that could give me a clue about who he was. But when I turned my head, he was just gone. No one. I stood there for a moment trying to process what had just happened. There was no sound of footsteps fading, no movement. He just disappeared. I looked in every direction, even along the sides of the trail, but he was nowhere. My mind couldn't wrap around it, but my body for some reason already felt this wave of unease washing over me. I had no idea what to do. Part of me wanted to believe the guy just took a different path, but something told me there was no way he could have vanished that quickly on a trail I knew so well. There were no shortcuts or spots he could have just hidden in like that. My mind started looking for rational explanations. Maybe someone in a rush had passed by a blind spot, but the thing was, he'd appeared out of nowhere, like he'd just materialized out of thin air. I decided to keep going, trying to shake that thought off, but the unease only grew, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. As I climbed the trail, the morning silence seemed to grow heavier. The wind didn't make a sound. The leaves on the trees stood completely still. My heart was racing, and with every step, part of me wondered if I was really alone. Something told me I wasn't. I stopped again, scanning my surroundings, trying to make sense of it all. That's when something caught my eye. A shadow moving at the edge of the trail. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing. The feeling of being watched returned full force, and I felt a pressure on my chest, like the air around me had become thicker. The strange events began to linger in my mind, growing more unsettling with each passing moment. I was starting to feel like I was in some kind of horror story, with something invisible following me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting, but then the feeling that someone was out there, watching me, became impossible to ignore. I spun around to look, and to my surprise, the man was there again, farther away now, but still just as inexplicable as before. He was standing there, no backpack, no sign of travel, just staring at me from the edge of the trail. What disturbed me even more was that even though I had turned around and looked directly at him, he didn't seem surprised or alarmed at all. There was nothing human about his behavior. He didn't move, not even a twitch, and he didn't break eye contact. His presence felt unnatural, like he didn't belong in this world. Every fiber of my being was telling me to run, to get out of there as fast as possible, but at the same time, something was holding me back. The sense that there was something I needed to understand, something bigger than my own safety, kept me frozen. I looked at him one last time, and in that moment his eyes, I don't know how to explain it, but they were empty, like there was no one home. They were completely opaque, lifeless, expressionless. That's when a wave of panic hit me, freezing me to my bones. I knew I wasn't dreaming, I wasn't hallucinating, but everything in my body was screaming for me to run. I started stepping backward quickly, never taking my eyes off him. But when I looked down at the ground for just a second and then looked up again, he was gone. It wasn't possible. I was sure he'd been there, staring at me, but now there was nothing. The trail was empty. The sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears felt deafening in the terrifying silence. I spun around looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Only the sound of the wind, or whatever was left of it, cutting through the barren landscape. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but then a cold sensation spread down my spine. A feeling I'd never experienced before, something I'd only read about in horror novels. The sense that something much bigger was happening there, something beyond my understanding. I started walking faster, almost running, but the trail seemed to stretch on endlessly in front of me. The fear that I might never be able to leave this place consumed me. As I approached a more open area with a panoramic view, my breath became shallow, and then there he was again, standing in front of me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who or what to believe anymore. This time he was even closer, just a few meters away, but still standing motionless, as if waiting for something from me. I tried to scream, but my voice failed me. The fear was so overwhelming that I could barely form words. He no longer seemed human. He no longer had the look of someone you'd encounter on a trail. It was as if he was part of the environment itself, like a shadow that doesn't fit the light. The air felt heavier, and I started sweating cold. I knew I couldn't stay there, but my legs were frozen, like something was holding me in place. Then he moved, but it was so subtle, so imperceptible that I almost didn't notice. He took a step, a simple movement, but the impact hit my mind like thunder. I was paralyzed. I tried to turn around, but the path that once felt familiar now seemed strange, like I was walking in circles. The trail closed in on me as if the very environment itself was trying to trap me. The man said nothing, did nothing but watch me. But the feeling of being hunted, of imminent danger, was undeniable. With every step I took, he was there, following me, always a step behind, but never closing the distance. It felt like I was playing a game of shadows with something I couldn't understand. Then, with a nearly suffocated scream of terror, I started running. I didn't look back, not once, but the feeling that he was still there, watching me, stayed with me all the way to the end of the trail. I don't know how I made it to the end of the trail, but when I saw the road and other people in the distance, something inside me finally relaxed. I was in shock, my legs trembling, my breath still shallow. Never in my life had I felt so vulnerable, so lost. I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible, so I didn't hesitate to leave the main trail and walk toward the parking lot. Deep down, I knew I shouldn't stay there any longer, but at the same time, something told me that the experience wasn't over, that I hadn't fully understood what had happened. And when I got close to my car, I still felt that man's presence in some way, as if he had stayed behind, waiting. Even so, what stayed with me the most was that after that day, I never found a logical explanation for what I had lived through. I didn't find any sign that he was lost or a tourist. He didn't seem human, but he didn't seem like a spirit or anything like that either. It was like he didn't belong to the same world as me. From time to time, I think back to that day, and I feel a chill running down my spine. I still don't understand what happened. Whether he was a real man, a spirit, or something even stranger, it was never clear to me. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed by something I can't comprehend, never went away. And honestly, I don't know if I'll ever get over what I went through that morning.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I'm John, and back then I was working the overnight shift at a diner downtown in Chicago. It wasn't exactly the best part of the city, and the place was practically empty at night. I had just turned 22, and working at the diner was my first real job after finishing high school. Most of the customers during the late hours were the same: truck drivers, night shift workers, and occasionally some folks who had nowhere else to go. It wasn't exactly my dream job, but the pay was good, and for some reason, working at night felt easier than during the day. That was, until that one night, the night I'll never forget. It was around 2 a.m. when he walked in. The guy seemed out of place, like he was just wandering around without any particular direction. But still, he came in and sat at the counter like it was the most normal thing in the world. He was wearing a dark coat, and his scruffy beard covered almost his entire face. I couldn't really put it into words, but there was something about his eyes that felt off. He didn't look at me the way most customers do, but more like he was staring at something beyond me, something I couldn't see. He placed a simple order: black coffee and a slice of apple pie. I got everything ready and set it in front of him, but what happened next left me with a weird, uncomfortable feeling. He didn't say anything more. He just stared at me. Not a word, just a fixed gaze that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. Time passed, and the guy seemed more and more restless, but there was no clear reason for it. He fidgeted with his hands, shifted in his seat, but always kept his eyes locked on me. At first, I thought maybe he was just tired or anxious from being up so late, but something about his behavior started to unsettle me. Every time I looked at him, that uneasy feeling grew. There was this tension in the air, like he was waiting for something or someone, but still, he didn't say a word. With every passing minute, the atmosphere felt thicker. The sounds of the diner, the coffee machine, the fryer seemed louder, more distant, like the world around me was shrinking. When I glanced at him again, his eyes were even more fixed on me, and then suddenly, he said something that made my blood run cold. "I see you!" That's what he said, in such a low tone I almost didn't catch it. But even so, those words scratched their way into my mind. I didn't get what he meant by it, but I knew it wasn't just some casual remark. A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. Up until then, he had just eaten and stayed quiet, but now it felt like he was trying to test me in some way, like he was waiting for me to react in a way I couldn't explain. The feeling of being watched with an intent far beyond a casual glance was palpable, and I couldn't hide my nervousness anymore. The guy kept staring at me, now with a slight smile on his face, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like he was enjoying my reaction, watching me squirm. "You don't know what's going on, do you?" he said in a low, drawn-out tone, almost like he was whispering just to me. By this point, I was on edge. I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't normal for someone to act this way, especially in such a quiet place like this. He looked at me like he had some sort of control over the situation, like he was in charge. I tried to look away, focusing on my work, but everything inside me screamed to get out of there, to leave as quickly as possible. That's when he stood up, silently, and took a step toward the counter. I don't know why, but I felt a chill run down my spine. He was so close now that the smell of the hot coffee I was making was overpowered by the scent of sweat and something else I couldn't quite place. I didn't know what to do. He wasn't being aggressive, he wasn't doing anything physically threatening, but the air around him felt charged, like he was about to explode at any moment. It was then that, on impulse, I decided to call the police. My heart was racing, my hands were sweating, but I knew I couldn't handle the tension anymore. As I grabbed the phone and dialed the number, I couldn't look away from him. He was watching me, but now there was something more, like he knew exactly what I was about to do, like he'd already planned out every move I'd make. When I finished the call, I could hear my breathing speeding up. I tried to stay calm as I explained to the dispatcher what was going on, but my words came out in broken pieces. I quickly told them about the strange man, describing his appearance and what he was doing, but as I spoke, I felt a growing pressure in the air around me. I could swear he was closer now, almost like he had moved in while I was talking to the police. When I hung up, I tried to take a deep breath, but he still hadn't left. It felt like he was surrounding me, like he was waiting for something to happen. The tension in the room was thick, and the only sound I could hear besides my own breathing was the distant hum of a radio, the weak light from the kitchen flickering occasionally. A few minutes later, the atmosphere grew heavier. He started moving, lightly tapping his fingers on the counter, and his words started becoming more disjointed. "You've never wondered why things are the way they are?" he said, almost as if he didn't expect an answer. "Things happen one way, but it's never the way you think it will." It didn't make sense, but at the same time, it felt like he was trying to pull me into some crazy conversation. I was freaking out, but something inside me told me to just wait for the police. But when I looked to the side to see if the man was still there, something froze me in place. He wasn't sitting in the chair anymore. He was nowhere to be found. I looked around, panic rising like a wave, and I even thought maybe he had left, but the doors were locked, and there was no sign he'd gone anywhere. All that was left was silence, and the feeling that he had never really left at all. The next few minutes were a nightmare. The police still hadn't arrived, and the feeling of unease seemed to grow with every passing second. The diner was completely silent, except for the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears and the flickering kitchen light, blinking erratically like it was failing. I walked around the room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Where had the man gone? There were no clues. Everything was in its place, but somehow, everything felt off. I wiped my forehead, trying to clear my thoughts, but when I looked back at the counter, a chill ran down my spine. There was a mark of dirt on the wooden surface. Something I swear wasn't there before. It was the imprint of a hand, with the palm open and the fingers spread, like someone had pressed hard on it. Something inside me told me that hand wasn't mine, nor any of the customers. When the police finally arrived, I was in shock, unsure of what to tell them. They searched the diner thoroughly, but found nothing. No sign of the man, no evidence to suggest he had ever been there. I showed them the mark on the counter, but the officers seemed skeptical. "Must be old dirt," one of them said, trying to reassure me, but I knew that wasn't normal. The strangest part was when I looked toward the exit and saw something I'll never be able to explain. There were faint footprints on the floor, almost imperceptible, but they led straight to the door. The problem was, the mark started in the middle of the room, where no one had been. No one but me. The man never passed through there, and he never left. But those marks, they were there, leading to the door, as if he had just vanished into thin air. The police couldn't find anything else. The diner was closed for a few hours for the investigation, but nothing more came up. When I went back to work the next night, everything seemed normal again, but I knew something was off. The smell of coffee and the soft light of the diner, which used to comfort me, now made me uneasy. Every corner seemed to hide something, and somehow the feeling of being watched never fully left me. The man, that stranger, had disappeared without a trace, but his presence still hung in the air, like a heavy fog that wouldn't lift. I never knew who he was or what really happened that night. But I can tell you this. To this day, I can't look at that diner the same way. I don't know if what happened was real, or if I was just imagining things because of the stress of the job, but one thing's for sure. Since that night, I never work alone overnight anymore. And if you ever find yourself working alone at night, and some strange person walks in, sits down, and starts staring at you without saying a word, maybe it's best to pay attention to the signs. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, but what you feel.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.